Hey everyone. The best-selling book in the history of mankind, 5 billion copies. The text on which entire civilizations built their laws, their morals, their understanding of death, sex, and power. Well, nobody actually knows who wrote it. You've been told Moses. You've been told the apostles. You've been told Paul. And when you push a little harder, when you corner the question, they pull out the trump card. God dictated it. There you go. End of discussion. Close the book, shut off your brain, go home. Except historians don't do that. And what they've uncovered over 2 centuries of painstaking research, and I mean painstaking, not 2 guys in a basement with a conspiracy board, is so fascinating it should be front-page news everywhere. But it never is. You get 14 documentaries about the pyramids, 8 about dinosaurs, 6 about sharks. But the question, who wrote the Bible? Nothing. Silence. A void. Why? Because it might be the most uncomfortable question you can ask. Not uncomfortable for faith? No, not necessarily. Uncomfortable for that little laziness inside all of us that makes us accept a simple answer when the real answer is complicated. Get comfortable. Today, we're opening the book and asking the questions nobody asks. And if Voltaire were watching this video, I think he'd have a little smirk on his face. Because this is exactly the kind of intellectual mess he lived for. The ground rules. Before we get into it, let me set the ground rules. Because I know, the second you touch religion, 2 camps lose their minds. On one side, the offended believer who tells you you're blaspheming. You don't understand spirituality. On the other, the armchair atheist who tells you it's all fake, it's all garbage, it's fairy tales for grown-ups, mirror images of each other. And both of them are lazy. I'm neither. I'm a guy who reads books. That's it. That's the whole thing. And in this case, I've been reading the books written by the people whose actual job this is. The historians, the textual scholars, the biblical critics. People who spend their lives studying 2,000-year-old manuscripts under a desk lamp in a university office. They're the ones I'm reporting to you, not my Sunday morning opinions. My goal is not to tear down anyone's faith. If your faith carries you, if it gives meaning to your days, if it helps you get through the night, good for you. I mean that. Who am I to judge? But I refuse to put my brain in a drawer. And Voltaire, since we're going to talk about him, understood that 250 years ago. He understood you can take the spiritual search seriously without handing over your brain. The two aren't incompatible. They never were. It's the people who tell you otherwise who have the problem. Theologians, by the way, have an admirable quality. When a problem shows up in a sacred text, they write a commentary. When a second problem shows up, they write a library. When a third problem shows up, they declare the mystery too great for human understanding. Very convenient. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to look at the problems one by one. And we'll see what human intelligence, when you actually let it work, has been able to figure out. So, the Bible. Let's start at the beginning. And right from the jump, things are already a mess. What you call the Bible is not a book. People say the Bible like they say the Constitution, as if it were one thing. One book, one author, period. Except it's not. The word Bible comes from the Greek biblia, meaning the books. Plural. Not biblion, the book. Biblia, the books. Right there on the label, it's telling you it's a collection. A library. And what a library. 73 books if you're Catholic. 66 if you're Protestant. A different number depending on which branch of orthodoxy you follow. Just that alone should raise a flag. If it's the Word of God, how come Christians themselves can't agree on how many books it contains? That's like having 3 different editions of the U.S. Constitution with different amendments, and all 3 claiming to be the official one. In law, you'd call that a problem. In religion, they call it a mystery. These texts span roughly 1,000 years of writing. 4,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's the distance between the fall of Rome and today. Different authors, different centuries, different languages. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and political worlds that had nothing to do with each other. And we wrap all of that under one cover and say, it's a book. That's like putting Homer, Shakespeare, and Stephen King in the same volume and declaring, same author, same era, same worldview. Who decided which texts made the cut and which ones got left out? That's what scholars call the canon. And the canon didn't fall from the sky. It's politics. Debates, power plays, backstabbing between bishops, texts being burned and texts being saved. We'll come back to that. But keep this in mind. Someone chose. Humans chose. Moses did not write the Torah. All right. Moses, the patriarch. The man who parts the sea, receives the 10 Commandments, leads an entire people through the desert. And for centuries, you've been told that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, what's called the Pentateuch, or the Torah in Judaism. Except there's a crack in that belief. And people spotted it way before Google was a thing. A Spanish rabbi in the 12th century, Abraham ibn Ezra, noticed some weird stuff in the text. Things that didn't add up. But he didn't dare go all the way with his reasoning. He left hints, coded allusions, kind of like a government employee writing a report knowing his bosses are going to read it. He didn't want to end up burned at the stake. Fair enough. 5 centuries later, Spinoza had no such hesitation. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a title that's a mouthful but a brilliant book, he lays it all out. And his argument is painfully simple. Deuteronomy, chapter 34, describes the death of Moses. And not just his death. The text says, essentially, never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses. Hold on. Stop. If Moses wrote the text, he wrote the account of his own death? And on top of that, a retrospective assessment of his career as a prophet that can only have been written by someone who lived long, very long after him? You see the problem? It's like finding a chapter in George Washington's memoirs that says, never again did America produce a leader of such stature. Signed, George Washington. You'd say, he didn't write that. And you'd be right. Add to that the fact that the text consistently refers to Moses in the third person. The Lord said to Moses, Moses went up the mountain. This isn't a diary. Someone else is telling the story. And that someone else uses phrases like, to this day, which implies a time gap of several centuries. Add to that the contradictions. Genesis tells the creation story twice. 2 versions. In chapter 1, God creates animals first, then man. In chapter 2, it's the other way around. In chapter 1, God is called Elohim. In chapter 2, he's called Yahweh. These aren't minor details. They're clues. Fingerprints of different hands, different eras, different theological visions, stitched together by a later editor who did his best to harmonize stories that weren't telling the same thing. And those clues, over the 18th and 19th centuries, cracked the whole thing open. Researchers, mostly German, started treating the Pentateuch text the way you'd treat any other ancient text. Vocabulary, style, themes, internal contradictions. The same method used for Homer or Sumerian literature. And they identified at least 4 distinct sources woven together by later editors. That's the famous documentary hypothesis, formalized by Julius Wellhausen in 1878. Short version. J, the Yahwist. A vivid, earthy storyteller who calls God Yahweh. God walks through the Garden of Eden, shapes man with his own hands. Probably the oldest source, around the 10th or 9th century BCE. E, the Elohist, who calls God Elohim. More restrained, more distant. Probably from the northern kingdom of Israel. D, the Deuteronomist. 7th century. And here's a juicy episode. In the second book of Kings, a priest discovers a book of the law in the Temple of Jerusalem. Just like that, on a random Tuesday afternoon. Oh, look, a sacred book forgotten behind a pillar. And this book happens to perfectly justify King Josiah's religious reform. Historians, who tend to have no sense of humor, believe the book wasn't discovered, but was composed right then and there. The oldest trick in the political playbook. You want to push an idea. You say it's an ancient text. It's Machiavelli, 1,000 years before Machiavelli. And P, the priestly source. The latest of the four, obsessed with rituals, genealogies, purity codes. Probably written during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE. Is this theory perfect? No. Scholars still debate the exact boundaries, the dating, the number of sources. Thomas Romer, who holds the chair in biblical environments at the Collège de France, not exactly a weekend blogger, has proposed more nuanced models. But on one point, the consensus has held for 150 years and has never wavered. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. It's the product of centuries of human hands. And this is taught at every major university in the world. Harvard, Oxford, Yale, Princeton, Tübingen. It's mainstream among historians. Yet 90% of the world's population has never heard of it. Humans handle mystery just fine, you know. What they can't handle is uncertainty. And I want to pause here because this bugs me. Why doesn't this information get around? Why do people with 15 years of education, master's degrees, doctorates, not know this? Why do we learn in history class that the Iliad was probably composed by multiple authors over several centuries? We accept that without blinking when it comes to Homer, but nobody ever says the same thing about the Bible? I'll give you my answer. It's not a conspiracy. It's dumber than that. It's a mix of three things. 1. School curricula avoid the topic because it's a political minefield. In most places, touching religion in a classroom means risking a parent complaint. So teachers play it safe. They say, the Bible is a foundational text of Western civilization, and they move on. 2. Religious institutions have zero incentive to spread this information. I'm not saying they actively lie. I'm saying they're not going to mail you a flyer that says, by the way, Moses didn't write the Torah. Have a nice day. That's not how it works. Silence is a very effective form of disinformation. 3, and this might be the most important reason, people don't want to know. It's uncomfortable. It's easier to live with a certainty than to embrace an uncertainty, even when the uncertainty is truer than the certainty. There's a concept that captures this perfectly, and it runs through the whole Enlightenment tradition: comfortable superstition. The idea that people will always prefer a reassuring error over a disturbing truth. 250 years after Voltaire, we haven't made much progress on that front. End of tangent. The Gospels, the question that changes everything. We're jumping ahead a few centuries. Leaving Hebrew for Greek, the ancient Near East for the Greco-Roman world. New Testament territory. And at the heart of the New Testament, the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. Straight question. Were these Gospels written by the apostles whose names they carry? No, not in the way most people think. And the rest of the story is fascinating, but it takes a minute. First fact. None of the 4 Gospels names its author internally. The titles, according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on, appear to have been added by tradition rather than by the authors themselves. Some early papyrus fragments do carry titles, which tells us the names were attached early, probably by the mid to late 2nd century. But the key point is this. The Gospels don't introduce themselves. The attributions come from the tradition around the texts, not from the texts themselves. And the first writer to insist on exactly 4 Gospels tied to 4 specific apostolic names is Irenaeus of Lyon, around 180 CE. And the reason is historically mundane and should surprise no one. In the ancient world, an anonymous text carried no authority? You want your text to be read? Respected? Passed down? You need a prestigious name on it. If you sign it, "Some guy from Corinth who had stuff to say," nobody's reading that. If you sign it, "Matthew, disciple of Christ," everyone listens. This was so common in antiquity that it has a technical name, pseudepigraphy. It wasn't a con. It's just how things worked back then. Our modern ideas of intellectual property and authorship simply didn't exist. Second fact, more disturbing. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke copy Mark. Word for word, sometimes across entire passages. Scholars have done the phrase-by-phrase comparison, painstaking work, and the borrowing is massive and undeniable. Now, if Matthew was really an apostle, a first-hand witness, a guy who ate with Jesus, slept next to him, traveled with him for 3 years, why would he need to copy someone else? That's like a war correspondent who was actually on the front lines filing his story by copying an article from a guy who stayed at the office. It doesn't hold up. Scholars, and we're talking broad consensus here, not fringe theory, believe Mark is the earliest gospel, written around 65 to 70 CE. Matthew and Luke come later, in the 80s and 90s, and they draw on 2 sources, Mark, which they copy, and a hypothetical source called Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source, which would have been a collection of Jesus' sayings now lost to history. That's the 2-source theory. Formulated in the 19th century, widely accepted today, even though Q itself is still debated. Some scholars, like Mark Goodacre at Duke, think Q never existed, and that Luke simply copied Matthew on top of Mark. The jury's still out. And while we're at it, let's open a parenthesis on the contradictions between the Gospels, because this is something people don't notice until you point it out. After that, it jumps off the page. Take the birth of Jesus. In Matthew, the family lives in Bethlehem. That's their town. They flee to Egypt because of Herod, then settle in Nazareth when they come back. In Luke, the family lives in Nazareth, travels to Bethlehem for a census, and goes right back to Nazareth. No flight to Egypt, no massacre of the innocents. 2 completely different stories for the same event. And most people don't realize it because we mash the 2 together in Christmas nativity scenes. You know, the wise men with the shepherds, the star with the angels, all in one picture. In reality, the wise men are Matthew's, the shepherds are Luke's. The 2 authors didn't know each other, never read each other, and told different versions. Take the death of Judas. In Matthew, he returns the money and hangs himself. In Acts, attributed to Luke, he buys a field with the blood money, falls headfirst, and his guts burst open. That's not a nuance. That's 2 incompatible accounts, and both of them are in your Bible, side by side. These aren't proof that everything is fake. They're proof that different authors, in different communities, told the story their own way, for their own reasons, to their own people. That's exactly what you'd expect when an event is retold by multiple people several decades later. Ask 3 witnesses to describe the same car crash. You'll get 3 versions. End of parenthesis. Back to our 4th gospel writer, John. John is a different animal entirely. If you read the first 3 gospels, the ones scholars call synoptic because they tell roughly the same story, and then you read John right after, it feels like you landed on a different planet. Jesus doesn't talk the same way. In the Synoptics, he speaks in short parables, little stories about sowers and mustard seeds. In John, he delivers long, mystical, almost abstract speeches. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's cosmic theater. It's beautiful. By the way, John is a towering writer, whoever he was. But it's radically different. The timeline is different. The theology is far more developed. The vocabulary is something else entirely. It's not the same author as the other 3. That much is obvious. And the dating of John, Most specialists place it between 90 and 110 CE, which would mean the Apostle John, the Galilean fisherman who used to cast nets in the Sea of Galilee, would have been between 80 and 100 years old. In a world where average life expectancy hovered around 40 to 45. And he would have written in sophisticated literary Greek, a fisherman who spoke Aramaic, turning out philosophical prose in literary Greek. Look, it's not technically impossible, but you'd need to do some real stretching to make it work. Raymond Brown, one of the greatest New Testament scholars of the 20th century, a Catholic priest, by the way, not an atheist on a mission, proposed the idea of a Johannine community, a circle of John's disciples who composed the text in stages over several decades. It's a clean hypothesis. And unlike a lot of theological answers, it doesn't ask you to stop thinking. One more thing on this, because I love this detail. In the 1980s, a group of American scholars called the Jesus Seminar did something pretty wild. They got together and voted, literally voted with colored beads on every saying attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. Red bead. Jesus definitely said that. Pink bead. Probably. Gray bead. Probably not. Black bead. Definitely not. The result? Only 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels got a red or pink bead. 82% of the things Jesus supposedly said in the Gospels were probably never said by him, according to these scholars. Now, the Jesus Seminar has been criticized for its methodology. Some scholars thought they were too skeptical, and their conclusions are not consensus. But the mere fact that specialists could arrive at those numbers tells you something about the nature of these texts. So, bottom line, and this is the key takeaway, the Gospels aren't journalism. They're not courtroom testimony. They're theological texts, written decades after the events, by authors who are probably not the people whose names they carry. That doesn't mean they have zero historical value. Historians do use the Gospels as sources, with the appropriate caution. But they're paintings, not photographs. Each one with its own framing, its own lighting, its own palette. The painter isn't the camera. Paul, the most important figure you've never really understood. Now we get to the part that fascinates me the most. Personally. And I'm going to spend some time here because this, I believe, is where the biggest surprise lies for most people. Paul. Paul of Tarsus. Saul, in his Hebrew name. Jewish Pharisee, Roman citizen, persecutor of Christians turned into their greatest champion. The conversion on the road to Damascus. You know the story. But what most people don't realize is that Paul might be the single most important figure in the history of Christianity. More important than the gospel writers. More important, and I don't say that lightly, for the history of Christianity as a world religion than Jesus himself. Let me explain. Jesus didn't write anything. Not a single line. Not a single word. He didn't found a church. Didn't create a theology. Didn't build a community structure. Other people did all of that. And the first, the most important, the most influential of them all was Paul. Paul's letters are the oldest texts in the New Testament, older than the Gospels. Paul writes in the 50s CE, barely 20 years after Jesus' death. Mark writes in the late 60s or early 70s. Matthew and Luke in the 80s and 90s. John around 90 to 110. Chronologically, Paul comes first, the Gospels come after. Most people don't know that, and it changes the whole picture. Dramatically. Because when you read Paul, the real Paul, not the Paul they manufactured later, I'm getting to that. You're reading someone who is closer in time to the Jesus event than any gospel writer. And paradoxically, Paul tells us almost nothing about Jesus' life. No parables, no miracles, no Sermon on the Mount, no walking on water, no feeding the 5,000. Paul doesn't care about what Jesus said or did during his earthly life. He cares about his death and his resurrection. That's it. The rest? Barely a word. And that is a wild historical fact. Let that sink in for a second. Let me put it another way. You have the oldest author in the New Testament, the one closest in time to Jesus, a man who personally met Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and he mentions virtually nothing about Jesus' biography. Not a single parable. He knows the Last Supper, he knows the crucifixion, he knows the resurrection. But the rest? All the stuff in the Gospels, the miracles, the teachings, the healings, the narrative arc, Paul says nothing about any of it. Either he didn't know those stories, or they didn't interest him, or, and this is the hypothesis that really makes your head spin, those stories didn't exist yet in narrative form during his time and developed later. Voltaire would have loved this detail, because it tells us something deep about how a religion is built. First, there's the event. Then there's the theological interpretation of the event. That's Paul. And only then, sometimes decades later, does someone write the story. The Gospels aren't the source. They're the result of a process. And Paul predates that narrative process. Sit with that for a second. It's not comfortable. All right, Paul's letters. There are 13 attributed to him in the New Testament. And here's where it gets really juicy, because out of those 13, scholars are nearly unanimous that only 7 were actually written by him. The 7 authentic ones, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. The other 6 fall on a spectrum. The pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, are considered pseudepigraphal by a strong majority of scholars. Ephesians and Colossians are disputed, with most scholars leaning toward pseudepigraphy, but with less unanimity. And 2 Thessalonians is genuinely contested. Some say authentic, others don't. The point is, at minimum 3, and probably more of the 13, were not written by Paul. And I want to be clear, this isn't some fringe opinion from people trying to dismantle Christianity. This is the mainstream position in secular and even many confessional universities. Catholic and Protestant scholars agree on most of this. How do we know? The vocabulary shifts. The style shifts. The concerns shift. Take the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus. They use words that appear nowhere in the authentic letters. They talk about bishops, deacons, church hierarchy, organizational structures that didn't exist in Paul's day but developed in the 2nd century. It's an anachronism. It's exactly like finding a letter supposedly written by Thomas Jefferson that talks about social media. The vocabulary gives away the era. Now, buckle up, because here's the twist nobody sees coming. Some of the most controversial positions in Christianity regarding women, the famous "let women be silent in the churches," come from letters Paul probably didn't write. The passage in question, in 1 Corinthians 14, is considered by many scholars to be an interpolation, a later insertion. It interrupts the flow of the argument. It contradicts what Paul says elsewhere in the same letter. It's a graft. And the most restrictive texts about women are found in the pastorals, which aren't by Paul. Now flip it around. The historical Paul, the one from the 7 authentic letters, actually mentions women in leadership positions. He calls Phoebe a diakonos, the same word he uses for himself. He calls Junia prominent among the apostles. He greets Prisca before her husband Aquila, a detail that in ancient letter-writing conventions indicates higher status. The real Paul was probably more open on the question of women than the fake Paul who got pasted on top of him 2 generations later. And it's the fake Paul, the manufactured, pseudepigraphal Paul, who shaped church doctrine for 2,000 years. History is often more twisted than the catechism. That's actually what makes it interesting. And if that sits weird with you, think about what it actually means in real life. For centuries, women were forbidden from preaching, teaching, and leading in the church, all by citing Paul. Paul said women should be silent, except Paul probably didn't say that. Someone else said it while pretending to be Paul. And on that basis, millions of women were silenced for 2 millennia. An entire architecture of domination was built on a text its supposed author almost certainly never wrote. If that's not a lesson in why textual criticism matters, I don't know what is. I always say, and this is a personal conviction, I own it, that most of humanity's intellectual tragedies don't come from cruelty. They come from laziness. Someone wrote something. Nobody checked who actually wrote it. And it got repeated for 2,000 years. That's it. Laziness. Laziness has done more damage throughout history than cruelty ever has. And I'll take it one step further. The real Paul is a fascinating character because he's a thinker. Not a bureaucrat, not an administrator, a thinker. Someone wrestling with ideas, contradicting himself sometimes, doubting, searching. When you read Romans or Galatians, you can feel a brain on fire. The Paul of the pastorals, by comparison, is an HR manager designing org charts. It's not the same person. The difference jumps off the page for anyone who reads both side by side without bias. So let's sum up. The figure who most influenced Christian doctrine is a man whose attributed writings are half, not his, whose most quoted positions are probably not his own, and whose actual thought, complex, nuanced, sometimes bold, was buried under the writings of his own followers. You couldn't make this up. And I'll tell you something. When I discovered all of this, not on a Netflix documentary, not on some conspiracy blog, but in scholarly books published by Oxford University Press and Yale University Press, I felt two things at once: betrayed and amazed. Betrayed because nobody told me this in 20 years of school. I heard about Paul in Sunday school. Whenever I actually went, I had Paul quoted at me left and right, but never once did anyone say, by the way, half of what's attributed to Paul wasn't written by him. Nobody. And amazed because the real Paul, the Paul of the 7 letters, is a far more interesting character than the caricature they made of him. He's a man who fights, who doubts, who sends furious letters, then tender ones. He's a human being, and we turned that human being into a marble statue. That's a shame. Marble statues are pretty, but they're cold. Copies of copies of copies. All right, different angle entirely. We've talked about the authors. Let's talk about the objects, the manuscripts, the actual physical stuff, the papyrus, the parchment. We have no originals of anything. Not an original of Genesis. Not an original of Mark. Not an original of a single letter from Paul. 0. What we have are copies, and not copies of the originals. Copies of copies of copies, because a manuscript wears out. It tears. It rots, so you copy it, and the copy gets copied, and so on for centuries. Bart Ehrman, professor at the University of North Carolina, one of the best communicators in the world on this subject, wrote an entire book about it, misquoting Jesus. What he documents is that the copies don't match each other. It's estimated that between the manuscripts of the New Testament, there are somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 textual variants. Read that number again. 400,000 variants. That's more variants than there are words in the entire New Testament. All right. Before the believers panic and the atheists do a victory lap, let's add nuance. The vast majority of these variants are minor, copyist errors, a missing and, a word flipped, stuff that changes absolutely nothing about the meaning. It's like writing, he went to the store versus he went to the Satra? Variant? Technically, yes. Impact on meaning? 0. And picture this for a second, because most people have never thought about the conditions under which these texts were copied. During the first 3 centuries, the copyists weren't professional monks in organized scriptoriums. No. Christians were a persecuted minority. Copies were made by volunteers, people who could read and write, which was already rare, often under rough conditions. They copied at night by the light of an oil lamp on papyrus that cost a fortune. Sometimes one person dictated while another wrote. And when you're dictating ancient Greek text with no punctuation, because ancient manuscripts had no punctuation, No spaces between words, no capital letters. Mistakes are inevitable. That's not carelessness. That's physics. You copy a 15,000-word text by hand, in a language with no spaces, by the light of a flickering flame. I guarantee you're going to make errors. Anyone would. The organized monastic scriptoriums, with professional copyists and proofreading systems, didn't come until the 4th or 5th century. But by then, the text had already lived through 3 centuries of handmade copying. And it's during those first 3 centuries that most of the significant variants appeared. Some of those variants are not minor at all. And those are the ones worth looking at closely. The ending of the Gospel of Mark. If you open your Bible to Mark 16, you get the resurrection. The women go to the tomb. They find it empty. A young man in white tells them, Jesus has risen. They flee, terrified. And the original text stops right there. Verse 8. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Full stop. That's how the first gospel ever written ends. No risen Jesus appearing to anyone. No go and make disciples of all nations. No Great Commission. Silence. Fear. An empty tomb. The end. The 12 verses that follow in most Bibles, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, are a later addition. They don't appear in the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, both from the 4th century. Most modern Bibles flag this in a footnote. But who reads footnotes? Nobody. Footnotes are where information goes to die. People read the headlines and stop there. Another case. Quieter but possibly heavier in its consequences. The Comma Johanneum. It's a passage in the first letter of John, chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, and it's the only place in the entire New Testament where the Trinity is explicitly stated. The Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one. That's the Trinitarian proof text, except it's missing from every ancient Greek manuscript. It only shows up in late Latin manuscripts. It's an addition. Someone added it. Well, someone did catch it. In the 16th century, Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest humanist of the Renaissance, the most learned man of his age. And he does something brave. He refuses to include it in his edition of the Greek New Testament. He essentially says, this passage isn't in any Greek manuscript I've examined, so I'm not putting it in. That's intellectual honesty. That should be the standard. And what happens? The church comes down on him. They pressure him. They threaten him. And a Greek manuscript containing the passage miraculously appears. A manuscript that modern scholars suspect may have been fabricated for the occasion. That's debated, but still. And Erasmus, under pressure, ends up including it in his 3rd edition. Truth gave way to the institution. Scholarship buckled under power. And that's a pattern you find in every era. The honest guy who calls it like he sees it, and the machine that makes him take it back. 500 years later, virtually every scholar confirms Erasmus was right the first time. The passage is spurious. He caved for nothing. Or rather, he caved because the cost of truth was too high for one man standing alone against an institution. What all of this tells you is that the text isn't a solid block that fell from heaven. It's a living organism that was copied, modified, expanded, and sometimes deliberately touched up for theological reasons over centuries. The text you hold in your hands has a history, and that history is human. Wonderfully, incredibly human. The War of the Christianities. During the first 3 centuries after the death of Jesus, from the crucifixion to the Council of Nicaea in 325, there wasn't one Christianity. There were dozens. This is a fact most people never learn, and it changes everything once you do. Communities all around the Mediterranean, with beliefs that were incompatible with each other. Some thought Jesus was a regular man whom God adopted at the moment of his baptism. Others thought he was God disguised as a man, a divine phantom who never truly suffered on the cross. And then you had the Gnostics, who believed there were two gods. One good God, distant, spiritual, and an inferior God, clumsy or malevolent, who created the material world. For the Gnostics, the God of the Old Testament was this inferior God, and Jesus came to reveal the existence of the true God, the one above. And these groups had their own texts: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. These aren't modern fabrications. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, buried in a jar by a monk trying to save it from destruction, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Some of them closely resemble sayings found in the canonical Gospels. Scholars like Helmut Koester at Harvard believe some of these sayings may be as old, possibly even older, than the versions in Matthew or Luke. So who decided which texts stayed and which ones went to the trash heap of history? The answer is dead simple: whoever won. Look, it's a universal pattern. You see it everywhere in history. The winner writes the story. The winner decides what counts as truth and what counts as heresy, what gets copied and what gets tossed in the fire. The Christianity that won out, what we now call orthodoxy, didn't win because it was the true one, and the others were the false ones. It won because it had the best networks, the best strategists, and above all, starting with Constantine in the 4th century, the backing of the Roman Empire. When the Emperor of Rome decides he's Christian, your little Gnostic community in Alexandria suddenly carries a lot less weight in the theological debate. And this is something people don't like hearing: the idea that theological truth was decided in part by political power dynamics. But that's how it went down. The councils, Nicaea in 325, Constantinople in 381, Chalcedon in 451, these weren't meditation retreats. They were political arenas where bishops backed by imperial factions fought to impose their vision. And the losers were declared heretics, exiled, their books burned. Theology, when it intersects with power, stops being a search for truth. It becomes a tool of control. And that's true for every religion. Every single one. No exceptions. The first person to list the 27 books of the New Testament as we know them today was Athanasius of Alexandria in 367, 337 years after the death of Jesus. 3.5 centuries of battles, schisms, burned texts, and rescued texts. History is written by the victors. The Bible is no exception. Archaeology weighs in. All right, I'll keep this chapter short, on purpose. Because the subject is so vast, it deserves its own video, and maybe I'll make one someday. But it needs to be mentioned here, because without it, the picture is incomplete. Regarding the Exodus, the departure from Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, 40 years wandering the desert, archaeologists have found no trace. Zero. And it's not for lack of trying. Israel Finkelstein, professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, an Israeli who has zero political motivation to downplay Israel's history, said it plainly in the Bible unearthed. No evidence of a large Hebrew population in Egypt, no evidence of an exodus through the Sinai. That doesn't mean nothing happened. Maybe a small group left Egypt and collective memory amplified the event over the centuries. But 600,000 men plus women and children wandering the desert for 40 years, if that had happened, there would be traces. There aren't. Jericho. The city whose walls came tumbling down at the sound of trumpets. Excavations show that Jericho probably didn't have walls at the time the conquest supposedly took place. It may not even have been inhabited. David and Solomon. The great united kingdom, Jerusalem as a glorious capital. Archaeology suggests that Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE was a modest hilltop village, not an imperial metropolis. Did David exist? Probably yes. The Tel Dan stele, discovered in 1993, mentions the House of David. But between a tribal chieftain and the great king described in the Bible, there might be an ocean. The Bible isn't a history book in the modern sense. It's a text of memory, of meaning, of identity. Its authors weren't trying to record facts the way a court reporter records testimony. They were trying to transmit meaning. And confusing the two is a disservice to both the text and the people who wrote it. What we know, what we don't, and what people keep repeating without thinking. Quick recap before we wrap up. What do historians know with a reasonable degree of certainty? The Bible was composed over more than 1,000 years by dozens of different authors. The Pentateuch was not written by Moses. The Gospels were not written by the apostles whose names they carry. Several of Paul's letters are not by Paul. The manuscripts contain hundreds of thousands of textual variants. The canon was established by humans over centuries according to criteria that had nothing supernatural about them. What's still debated? A lot. Exact dates for many texts. The precise nature of the Pentateuch's sources, written documents or oral traditions. Whether Q actually existed. The degree of historicity of each narrative. The identity of the beloved disciple in John. There's no shortage of hypotheses. Certainties, on the other hand, are in short supply. And the myths? They die hard. The Bible is a single, coherent book. No, it's a patchwork that contradicts itself. The text was transmitted faithfully without any changes. No, it was altered, and the alterations are documented. The Gospels are eyewitness accounts. No, they're second or third-hand texts. The Da Vinci Code revealed everything. Dan Brown is a good novelist, not a historian, and he's definitely not the same Brown as Raymond Brown. And the most toxic myth of all, if the authors aren't who we thought, the text is worthless. No. The value of a text doesn't depend on who wrote it. The Iliad is a masterpiece, whether Homer wrote it alone or not. The beauty of a gospel doesn't vanish when you learn its author is anonymous. If anything, it deepens. When I discovered all of this, the documentary hypothesis, pseudepigraphy, the history of the canon, the manuscript tradition, my first reaction wasn't anger, or contempt, or triumph. It caught me off guard. It was awe, because the real story is so much richer than the official version. The official version, God dictated, men wrote, close the book. It's flat. It's dead. It goes nowhere. The real story, scribes working by the light of oil lamps, communities tearing themselves apart over what's sacred, texts crossing empires, surviving fires, outlasting centuries of darkness, anonymous hands copying, editing, adding, and yes, sometimes inventing. It's messy and magnificent and deeply human. It might be the greatest intellectual adventure we've ever pulled off. And we want to reduce that to a dictation? And sometimes, when I talk about this stuff with people, they say, yeah, but what's the point of knowing all that? People are happy in their faith. Why are you messing with that? And it's a fair question. I'll answer it. It matters because truth is not a luxury. It's not a hobby for bored intellectuals on a Sunday afternoon. Truth is the foundation. When you build your life, your morals, your relationships on a text, the bare minimum is knowing what that text actually is. Where it came from, who wrote it, in what context, with what intentions. Otherwise, you're living in a house and you've never once checked whether the foundation holds. Maybe it does. Maybe the house is solid. But you don't want to check? Really? You'd rather not know? I'd rather know. Even if it makes me a little uncomfortable. Even if it complicates things. A complicated truth will always be worth more than a simple lie. Always. And that's what Voltaire understood, I think, better than anyone. He understood that asking questions is not an act of destruction. It's an act of respect. Respecting a text means really reading it. Looking at it with your eyes open. Not mumbling it on your knees. Reading it standing up. And this question, who wrote the Bible, it's not a question attacking faith. It's a question for people who'd rather think than repeat. People who take the text seriously enough to want to understand it. Not parrot it. Not wave it around like a flag. Understand it. If this video made you think, if it made you a little uneasy, good. Doubt isn't a flaw. It's not a weakness. It's the sign that your brain is doing its job. The day you stop doubting, that's when you should worry. In the next episode, we'll go look at what the texts that were excluded from the Bible have to tell us. The Apocrypha, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. And we'll ask a question that'll make your head spin. What if the Christianity we know is just one of the possible versions of the story? Until then, take care of yourselves. And above all, take care of your curiosity. It's the most valuable thing you've got. Once it's gone, everything else goes with it. See you soon.